The November wind howled through the Mogollon Mountains of Arizona Territory with a ferocity that seemed to carry the spirits of winter itself. At 8,000 feet above sea level, the pine forests were already heavy with early snow, and temperatures that could kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. Jack Sullivan pulled his wool coat tighter as he guided his horse ranger through the narrow mountain trail that led back to the line camp where he'd been spending the winter months watching over his boss's scattered cattle. At 35, Jack had spent most of his adult life in these mountains, working for the Bar T Ranch that ran cattle across 50,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving country in the territory. The line camp was a simple log cabin built into a sheltered canyon where cattle could find protection from the worst winter storms. Jack lived there alone from October through March, checking on the herd, repairing fences damaged by snow and wind, and maintaining the careful solitude that had become his preferred way of life since the war ended nearly 20 years ago. Tonight was different, though. As Jack approached the canyon where his cabin sat nestled among towering ponderosa pines, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Human screams echoing off the canyon walls, desperate and terrified, cutting through the wind like a blade. Jack spurred Ranger forward, drawing his Winchester rifle from its saddle scabbard as they raced toward the sound. What he saw when he crested the small ridge above his cabin would haunt his dreams for years to come. In the clearing beside a smaller log structure that he'd assumed was an abandoned trapper's cabin, a pack of gray wolves had cornered what appeared to be a young Apache woman. She stood with her back against the cabin door, clutching something tightly to her chest. While 6 wolves circled with the patient hunger of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run, the woman was clearly exhausted and nearly frozen, her traditional Apache dress inadequate protection against the brutal mountain cold. But what struck Jack most was what she held in her arms, a small bundle that could only be an infant, barely visible beneath the blanket she'd wrapped around it, a mother protecting her child from a pack of wolves, alone in the frozen mountains with no weapon and no hope of escape. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his Winchester and fired, dropping the lead wolf with a shot that echoed like thunder through the canyon. The pack scattered momentarily, then regrouped with the wary intelligence of creatures who understood they now faced a more dangerous opponent. "Get inside," Jack shouted to the woman as he worked the rifle's lever action, chambering another round. "Get behind something solid." But the woman couldn't get inside. Jack could see now that she was fumbling with the door latch with hands too numb from cold to work properly. She was trapped outside while the wolves regrouped for another attack. Jack spurred Ranger down the slope, firing as he rode and yelling at the top of his lungs to frighten the pack. 2 more shots scattered the wolves temporarily, but Jack knew they wouldn't stay gone long. Winter-hungry wolves were desperate enough to challenge almost any threat when they smelled easy prey. As he reached the clearing, Jack leaped from his saddle and ran toward the Apache woman, still clutching her infant with shaking hands. Up close he could see that she was young, maybe 25, and beautiful despite her exhaustion and terror. "Ma'am, let me help you with that door," Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. But as he reached for the door handle, Jack made a discovery that changed everything. The cabin wasn't abandoned. Fresh smoke rose from its chimney. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and the interior was clearly lived in. This Apache woman wasn't a lost traveler. This was her home. And Jack Sullivan, in saving her from the wolves, had just discovered that he'd been living for months, just a few hundred yards from an Apache family, completely unaware of their presence in what he'd thought was empty wilderness. The wolves howled in the darkness beyond the clearing, regrouping for another attack that would come as soon as they worked up their courage again. Inside the warm cabin, Jack quickly barred the door while the Apache woman collapsed into a chair near the fireplace, still clutching her baby to her chest. The infant, miraculously, seemed unharmed by their terrifying ordeal, though both mother and child showed signs of exposure to the brutal cold. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked gently, setting his rifle within easy reach while keeping his voice low to avoid frightening her further. The woman shook her head, but Jack could see she was suffering from more than just cold. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, her breathing was shallow, and her dark eyes held the wide-eyed look of someone who had just survived something she hadn't expected to live through. "I'm Jack Sullivan," he said, pulling another chair close to the fire. Been living up the ridge at the line camp for the Bartee Ranch. I didn't know anyone else was living in this canyon. The woman studied his face carefully before responding. I am Ayanna, she said in careful English. This is my daughter, Little Star. She looked down at the infant in her arms with an expression of fierce maternal protection that needed no translation. How long have you been living here? Jack asked, genuinely curious about how an Apache woman with a baby had come to be living alone in one of the most isolated locations in Arizona Territory. 3 months, Ayanna replied, since my husband was killed by soldiers near Fort Apache. The simple statement carried a weight of grief and loss that hit Jack like a physical blow. He understood now why she was living alone in the mountains. She was a war widow, probably driven from her tribal community by circumstances he could only guess at. Outside, the wolves had returned, circling the cabin and testing for weaknesses. Jack could hear them sniffing around the walls, occasionally scratching at the logs or whining with frustrated hunger. They'll keep trying until dawn, Jack said, checking his rifle's ammunition. Wolves don't give up easy when they're this hungry. You should not have helped me, Ayanna said quietly. Now they will attack you too. Ma'am, I couldn't let a mother and baby get eaten by wolves regardless of what trouble it might cause me. Jack poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Besides, looks like we're neighbors. Neighbors help each other out here. The concept of a white rancher considering her a neighbor seemed to surprise Ayanna. She studied Jack's weathered face with new interest, as if trying to determine whether his kindness was genuine or a trap of some kind. You are not afraid of Apache, woman? She asked. Should I be? Jack replied. You got a baby to take care of, you're living peaceful like in a cabin, and you were being attacked by wolves same as I would be. Don't see much difference between us except you've had a harder time of it lately. Little Star chose that moment to wake up and begin crying with the powerful voice that all healthy babies seem to possess. Ayanna immediately began nursing her daughter, and Jack turned away respectfully to give them privacy. The baby's father? Jack asked carefully, not wanting to intrude but needing to understand the situation he'd stumbled into. White soldier, Ayanna said simply. He promised to marry me, but when his captain learned about the baby, she shrugged, the gesture conveying a lifetime of broken promises and dashed hopes. Jack felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, and the same anger he'd carried since the war ended, and he'd seen how little honor some men showed toward the women who trusted them. He'd known too many soldiers who made promises to women they had no intention of keeping. What's his name? Jack asked, though he wasn't sure what he'd do with the information. Lieutenant James Morrison. He was transferred to California when Little Star was born. The wolves continued to prowl outside, but Jack noticed their howls were becoming less frequent. Dawn was still hours away, but the pack seemed to be losing interest in prey that was defended by someone with a rifle. Ayanna, when morning comes, those wolves will probably move on to look for easier hunting. But winter's just getting started and you can't stay up here alone with a baby. It's too dangerous. I have nowhere else to go, she replied simply. My people, they believe I brought shame to our band by lying with white soldier. His people think I am just Indian woman who seduced honorable officer. I belong to neither world now. Jack understood the impossible position she was in, rejected by both communities, trying to survive alone in wilderness that could kill the most experienced frontiersman. Well, Jack said slowly, maybe we can figure something out. Winter's going to be long and hard, and these mountains are big enough for neighbors to help each other without anyone else needing to know about it. Outside, the wolves had finally given up their siege, disappearing into the forest to search for prey that didn't shoot back. But inside the warm cabin, two people who had every reason to distrust each other were beginning to forge an unlikely alliance that would soon test everything they believed about loyalty, honor, and the possibility of finding family in the most unexpected places. The morning sun revealed a landscape transformed by overnight snowfall that had turned the canyon into a winter wonderland of pristine white, punctuated by dark green pines. Jack woke on Ayanna's floor near the fireplace, his rifle still close at hand, to the smell of coffee and something that might have been corn cakes cooking on the wood stove. Good morning, Ayanna said quietly as Jack stirred. She was moving around the small cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast while Little Star slept peacefully in a cradle that Jack now realized was beautifully crafted from pine and decorated with traditional Apache beadwork. Morning, Jack replied, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. Wolves stay away? They left before dawn. You saved our lives, Jack Sullivan. In Apache tradition, this creates debt that must be acknowledged. Jack accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, noting that it was better than anything he'd managed to make in his own cabin. Don't worry about any debt. Like I said, we're neighbors. But as they shared breakfast in comfortable silence, Jack began to understand the complexity of their situation. Ayanna was clearly an intelligent, capable woman who had managed to survive alone in harsh conditions that would challenge most men. Her cabin was well organized and efficiently heated. Her baby was healthy and obviously well cared for, and she seemed to possess wilderness skills that Jack respected. How did you know to come to this canyon? Jack asked. My grandmother lived here when she was a young girl, Ayanna explained. Before the soldiers came, before the reservations, Apache people lived all through these mountains. She told me stories about hidden places where families could survive if the world became too dangerous. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She taught me many things, how to find water in dry places, which plants can heal and which can kill, how to read weather signs and animal behavior. Ayanna paused, then added, she also taught me that sometimes enemies can become friends if both people choose honor over fear. The philosophical observation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to examine directly. A sound from outside interrupted their conversation. Not wolves this time, but something that made Ayanna go rigid with alarm. It was the distant sound of many horses moving fast through the forest, getting closer. Apache warriors, Ayanna whispered, her face going pale with fear. My father has found me. Jack moved to the window and felt his stomach drop at what he saw approaching through the trees. It wasn't just a few Apache warriors. It was what appeared to be an entire war party. Dozens of mounted men in traditional battle dress, moving through the forest with the disciplined coordination of experienced fighters. How many? Jack asked, though he was already counting and didn't like the numbers. Many, Ayanna replied, clutching Little Star protectively to her chest. If my father thinks you have harmed me or taken me against my will. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack understood that his presence in an Apache woman's cabin, alone with her and her infant daughter, could be interpreted in ways that would result in his immediate and painful death. Ayanna, you need to explain the situation to them as soon as they arrive. Make it clear that I helped you, didn't harm you. I will try, she said, but her expression suggested she wasn't confident that her father would listen to explanations before taking action. The war party had reached the edge of the clearing now, and Jack could see the leader, a man who could only be Ayanna's father, based on his bearing and the deference the other warriors showed him. The chief was an impressive figure, probably in his 50s, with the kind of natural authority that commanded respect from both friends and enemies. That's Chief Running Wolf, Ayanna confirmed. He is. Not a patient man when his family is threatened. Through the window, Jack watched as the chief raised his hand, and the entire war party came to a halt in perfect formation. Then Chief Running Wolf rode forward alone, dismounting 20 yards from the cabin door. Ayanna, the chief called out in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. Come out so your father can see you are unharmed. Jack looked at Ayanna, who was trembling again. Not from cold this time, but from the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine whether her rescue from the wolves had simply postponed her death and that of the man who had tried to help her. What do you want me to do? Jack asked quietly. Come with me, Ayanna said, her voice steady despite her fear. Face my father with honor. It is the only chance for both of us to survive. Jack picked up his rifle, not as a weapon but as a symbol of his readiness to face whatever consequences his kindness had brought. Together, he and Ayanna walked toward the cabin door and the confrontation that would determine their fate. Chief Running Wolf stood in the snowy clearing like a statue carved from granite, his weathered face showing no emotion as his daughter emerged from the cabin carrying Little Star, followed by the white cowboy who had apparently spent the night under the same roof. Behind the chief, nearly 100 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, their weapons visible but not yet raised in direct threat. The silence was so complete that Jack could hear his own heartbeat as he and Ayanna approached her father. Father, Ayanna said in Apache, then switched to English so Jack could understand. This is Jack Sullivan. He saved Little Star and me from wolves last night. Chief Running Wolf's dark eyes moved from his daughter to Jack, studying the white man with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential threat. The chief was younger than Jack had first thought, probably mid-40s, but he carried himself with the confidence of a leader who had successfully protected his people through decades of conflict and change. "You are the cowboy who lives in the canyon above," Chief Running Wolf said in careful English. "We know of your presence here." The statement hit Jack like a physical blow. "You've been watching me?" "We watch all white men who enter our traditional lands," the chief replied matter-of-factly. "You have lived quietly, harmed no one, taken only what you needed from the forest. This earned you the right to remain unmolested." Jack realized that his months of solitary ranching had been conducted under the observation of Apache scouts, and his behavior had been judged and found acceptable according to their standards. "Chief Running Wolf," Jack said formally, "your daughter was being attacked by wolves when I found her. I helped because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return." The chief walked closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Show me your hands," he commanded. Confused but compliant, Jack held out his hands palm up. Chief Running Wolf examined them carefully, noting the calluses and scars that marked years of honest labor, the absence of rings or jewelry that might indicate wealth gained through questionable means. "These are hands that work, not hands that take," the chief observed. "Ayanna, tell me exactly what happened." What followed was Ayanna's detailed account of the previous night's events, told in a mixture of Apache and English that allowed both her father and Jack to understand. She described the wolf attack, Jack's intervention, and his respectful behavior throughout their time together. When she finished, Chief Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing not just the facts of the story, but its implications for his daughter's honor and his own obligations as a leader. "Sullivan," the chief said finally, "in Apache tradition, the man who saves a mother and child becomes family to that mother and child. Do you understand what this means?" Jack had a feeling he was about to learn something that would complicate his life considerably. "No, sir, I don't. It means you now have responsibilities to Ayanna and Little Star. It means their welfare is connected to your honor. It means you cannot simply return to your solitary life and forget that they exist." The concept of being adopted into Apache family obligations through an act of rescue was foreign to Jack, but he could see the logic in it. A culture that survived in harsh wilderness would need strong social bonds and clear expectations of mutual support. "What kind of responsibilities?" Jack asked. "Protection, support, guidance for the child as she grows. The duties that fathers and uncles perform for their family members." Ayanna listened to this conversation with growing alarm. "Father Jack Sullivan has his own life. He should not be burdened with obligations to us. Daughter, he chose to accept these obligations when he chose to save your lives. Honor requires recognition of what has been freely given." Chief Running Wolf turned back to Jack with an expression that demanded complete honesty. "Sullivan, do you accept these responsibilities willingly, or do you wish to reject the obligations that come with your heroic actions?" Jack looked at Ayanna holding Little Star, this young woman who had been abandoned by the father of her child and rejected by both Apache and white communities, trying to survive alone in wilderness that could kill her at any time. "Chief Running Wolf," Jack said slowly, "I accept whatever obligations come with doing what's right. Ayanna and Little Star deserve protection and support, and if that's now part of my responsibilities, I'll do my best to fulfill them." The chief's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good. Then we have much to discuss about how this arrangement will work." As the morning sun climbed higher over the snow-covered canyon, Jack Sullivan realized that his life as a solitary cowboy was over. He was now part of an Apache family, with all the complications and rewards that such an unexpected connection would bring. What followed Chief Running Wolf's acceptance of Jack into the family structure was unlike anything in Jack's experience. The Apache war party transformed from a potential threat into an extended family gathering, with warriors dismounting to examine Little Star with the fond attention that uncles and cousins typically shower on new babies. "She is strong," observed Gray Eagle, Chief Running Wolf's younger brother and war leader of the band. "She will grow to be a woman who brings honor to our people." Jack watched in amazement, as hardened warriors who had ridden, prepared for battle, became gentle relatives discussing Little Star's resemblance to various family members and debating her potential future within the tribe. This is very different from what I expected, Jack admitted to Ayana as they watched the transformation. Apache men are fierce warriors when defending family, Ayana explained, but they are also devoted fathers and uncles who believe children are our most precious possessions. Little Star now has dozens of protectors who will teach her the skills she needs to survive and thrive. Chief, Running Wolf approached them with a proposal that would test everything Jack thought he understood about his new family obligations. Sullivan, winter will be harsh this year. Ayana and the child cannot remain alone in this cabin during the coldest months. They must come to our winter village where the tribe can provide proper protection and support. That makes sense, Jack agreed, though he wondered what role he was expected to play in this arrangement. You will come with them, the chief continued matter-of-factly. Sir, I appreciate the invitation, but I've got cattle to watch for the Bartee Ranch. My boss is counting on me to keep them alive through the winter. Chief Running Wolf exchanged a glance with Gray Eagle that seemed to communicate volumes. Your cattle are in the canyon 5 miles north? Yes, sir. We know of these cattle. Our scouts report that winter will bring storms that could kill many animals in exposed positions. The cattle should be moved to better shelter. I've been planning to move them to lower pastures, but it's a big job for one man. Not a big job for many men working together, Gray Eagle interjected. Apache people understand cattle. We can help move your animals to safe places, and you can help protect our family members who need winter shelter. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Jack would fulfill his ranch obligations with Apache assistance, while the Apache would gain a skilled cowboy's help in protecting Ayana and Little Star during the dangerous winter months. What does your boss think about Apache people helping with his cattle? Ayana asked, raising the obvious complication. Mr. Thompson's a practical man, Jack said slowly. If the cattle survive the winter healthy, he won't ask too many questions about how it happened. That afternoon, Jack found himself participating in the most unusual cattle drive of his career. 30 Apache warriors, working with the coordinated efficiency of men who understood livestock management, helped him move over 200 head of cattle from exposed winter pastures to sheltered valleys where they could survive even the worst blizzards. Your people know cattle work, Jack observed to Gray Eagle as they watched the herd settling into its new location. Apache people learned to manage horses and cattle from Spanish colonists 300 years ago, Gray Eagle replied. We understand these animals better than most white ranchers, but we are rarely given credit for such knowledge. As evening approached, the combined Apache and Bartee cattle operation had accomplished in one day what would have taken Jack weeks to complete alone. More importantly, the collaboration had established working relationships that would benefit everyone involved throughout the difficult months ahead. Sullivan, Chief Running Wolf said as they prepared to leave for the Apache winter village, you have seen today what is possible when different peoples work together instead of fighting each other. Yes, sir, I have. Remember this lesson. It will be important for Little Star's future, and for the future of all our peoples in this territory. As they rode through the pine forests toward the hidden valley where the Apache band would spend the winter, Jack Sullivan reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 2 days. He had started as a solitary cowboy watching cattle in the wilderness. Now he was an honorary member of an Apache family, heading toward a winter that would test everything he thought he knew about survival, community, and the possibilities for friendship between peoples who had been enemies for generations. Behind him, Ayana rode with Little Star bundled warmly against her chest, protected now not just by her mother's love but by the combined strength of Apache tradition and cowboy determination. And ahead lay adventures that none of them could imagine, born from the simple act of one man's decision to help a mother and child in desperate need. The Apache winter village was hidden in a valley so perfectly concealed that Jack would have ridden past it a dozen times without seeing the entrance. Chief Running Wolf led the group through a narrow canyon that opened into a sheltered basin, where over 300 Apache people had established a temporary city that would serve as home until spring returned to the high country. We have used this valley for winter camps for more generations than anyone can count, Ayana explained as they rode past carefully arranged tipis and permanent structures that showed the community's long familiarity with this location. The hot springs provide warm water even in the coldest weather, and the canyon walls protect us from the worst storms. Jack was amazed by the sophisticated organization of the village. Gardens had been terraced into the valley floor. Food storage facilities were built into natural caves in the canyon walls, and workshops for various crafts were positioned to take advantage of the best light and ventilation. "This is more permanent than I expected," Jack observed. "Apache people are not nomads." Chief Running Wolf corrected a common misconception. "We move seasonally between established camps that have been developed and improved over centuries. This valley has everything needed to support our people through winter: water, shelter, stored food, and protection from both weather and enemies." Jack's presence in the village created considerable interest among the Apache residents. Most had never seen a white man up close, and his adoption into Chief Running Wolf's family was unprecedented in tribal memory. "They're curious about you," Ayanna said as they walked through the village toward the lodge that had been prepared for their use. "But Father has explained that you saved Little Star and me, so you are welcome here as family." The lodge was larger than Jack had expected, with separate sleeping areas for him and for Ayanna and Little Star, along with a central living space around a fire pit that provided both heat and light. "This is more comfortable than my line camp," Jack admitted as he examined the expertly constructed dwelling. "Apache women are skilled builders," Ayanna said with obvious pride. "We create homes that are warm in winter, cool in summer, and can be moved or rebuilt as circumstances require." Over the following days, Jack found himself integrated into the daily life of the Apache community in ways that challenged every assumption he'd held about Indian peoples. Far from the savage warriors described in territorial newspapers, he discovered a complex society with sophisticated systems of governance, education, and resource management. "Your grandson has potential to be great leader," Stone Bear, the village's elderly medicine man, told Chief Running Wolf as they watched Jack working with a group of Apache men to repair winter damage to the food storage caves. "How do you see this?" the chief asked respectfully. "He learns quickly, listens more than he speaks, and shows respect for knowledge that is new to him. Also, he works without complaint at tasks that benefit the community rather than just himself." Jack was indeed learning rapidly. Under the tutelage of Apache experts, he discovered techniques for winter survival that were far superior to anything he'd learned during his years as a cowboy. Apache methods of food preservation, shelter construction, and weather prediction were based on centuries of accumulated wisdom about living successfully in harsh environments. White settlers could learn much from Apache knowledge. Jack observed to Gray Eagle as they worked together on repairing equipment. "Yes, but most white people believe they already know everything worth knowing," Gray Eagle replied. "They see Apache ways as primitive rather than sophisticated. Some of us are willing to learn. Some, but not many." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the village entrance. Scouts were returning with news that would test the strength of the bonds Jack had formed with his new Apache family. "Soldiers," the lead scout reported to Chief Running Wolf. 2 days' ride from here, moving toward the Winter Valley." They carried papers and asked questions about White Cowboy who disappeared from Bartee Ranch. Jack felt his stomach clench as the implications became clear. His extended absence from the line camp had been noticed, and someone had sent cavalry to investigate. If soldiers found him living with Apache people, it could trigger exactly the kind of conflict that everyone had worked to avoid. "They are looking for you specifically," Chief Running Wolf said to Jack. "Someone has reported you missing, and possibly killed by Apache raiders. My boss wouldn't send soldiers unless he thought something serious had happened to me," Jack said. "I need to get back to the line camp and let people know I'm all right." "If you leave now, you may not be able to return before spring," Ayanna said quietly. "The winter storms are coming and travel will be dangerous." Jack looked around the warm lodge where he'd spent the most contented weeks of his adult life. At Ayanna and Little Star, who had become more important to him than his own safety. At the Apache community that had welcomed him as family. "Then I guess I better make sure I can come back," he said with a determination that would soon be tested by forces beyond anyone's control. The cavalry patrol that found Jack at his line camp 3 days later was led by Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, a young officer whose rigid military bearing and suspicious attitude made it clear that he viewed Jack's prolonged absence as potentially treasonous behavior. "Mr. Sullivan," Lieutenant Morrison said as he dismounted in front of Jack's cabin, Your employer reported you missing over a week ago. There were concerns that you might have been killed or captured by hostile Indians. As you can see, Lieutenant, I'm alive and well, Jack replied, gesturing toward the cattle that grazed peacefully in the canyon below. Just been doing my job, keeping the herd safe through early winter weather. Lieutenant Morrison examined the cattle with the critical eye of someone looking for evidence to support preconceived suspicions. The animals appear to be in excellent condition, better condition than might be expected given recent weather reports. I've learned some new techniques for winter cattle management, Jack said carefully. What kind of techniques? Better sheltering, improved grazing rotation, more effective use of natural feed supplements. Jack was technically telling the truth while avoiding any mention of Apache assistance. Mr. Sullivan, we found tracks around your camp that appear to be made by unshod horses, Indian ponies most likely. Can you explain this? Jack had expected this question and prepared his answer accordingly. Lieutenant, these mountains are full of wild horses. Always have been. Some of them probably used to belong to Apache bands, but they've been running loose for years. Lieutenant Morrison wasn't satisfied with this explanation, but he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Mr. Sullivan, I want to be very clear about something. If you're having any contact with hostile Indian bands, you're required by territorial law to report such contact immediately to military authorities. I understand territorial law, Lieutenant. Good. Because we have reports of Apache activity in this region, and anyone found to be providing aid or comfort to hostile Indians will be arrested and charged with treason. After the patrol departed, Jack sat on his cabin porch and wrestled with the most difficult decision of his life. He could remain at the line camp, fulfill his obligations to the Bartee Ranch, and gradually distance himself from his Apache family until the military scrutiny passed. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that would protect his job and his future in territorial society. Or he could honor the obligations he'd accepted when he saved Ayanna and Little Star, even if it meant risking everything else he'd built in his life. That evening, as snow began to fall and the temperature dropped toward dangerous levels, Jack made his choice. He saddled Ranger, loaded supplies that would last him through the worst of winter, and rode back toward the hidden valley where his real family waited. What he found when he arrived at the Apache village was a crisis that would test every bond he'd formed and every lesson he'd learned about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. Jack. Ayanna ran to meet him as he rode into the village, her face showing relief mixed with fear. Little Star is sick, very sick. The medicine people have done everything they know, but she didn't need to finish. Jack could see the gravity of the situation in her expression and in the solemn faces of the Apache people who gathered around them. What kind of sickness? Jack asked as he followed Ayanna to their lodge. Fever, difficulty breathing, crying that won't stop. Stone Bear says it is the white man's disease, or what you call pneumonia. Jack looked down at Little Star, the beautiful baby whose life he'd helped save from wolves, now fighting a different kind of battle against an enemy that Apache medicine couldn't defeat. We need a doctor, Jack said firmly. A white doctor with white medicine. The nearest doctor is in Prescott, Chief Running Wolf said quietly. 3 days hard riding through mountain passes that may already be blocked by snow. Then we better get started, Jack replied, already planning the most dangerous journey of his life. But as he prepared to carry a desperately sick Apache baby through a winter storm to find medical help in a white town, where both of them might face hostility or worse, Jack Sullivan realized that some choices define who you are forever, and this was one of them. The ride to Prescott through mountain passes choked with snow would have challenged the most experienced winter travelers. But Jack Sullivan was no longer just an experienced cowboy. He was a desperate father racing to save his daughter's life. Little Star rode bundled against Jack's chest, her small body burning with fever despite the multiple layers of wool and fur that Ayanna had wrapped around her. Every few miles, Jack stopped to check on the baby's breathing and to feed her small amounts of water when she was conscious enough to swallow. Stay with me, Little Star, Jack whispered as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail, where one wrong step would send horse and rider plummeting into a canyon. Your mama's waiting for you, and so am I. The journey that normally took 2 days stretched into 3 as Jack was forced to take shelter during the worst of the storm, huddling with Ranger and Little Star in whatever protection they could find, while wind howled around them with deadly intensity. By the time they reached Prescott, Little Star was barely responsive, her breathing so shallow that Jack had to hold his ear close to her mouth to be sure she was still alive. The territorial town, normally bustling with miners and ranchers, was nearly deserted due to the storm, but Jack knew where to find help. Dr. William Henderson had been practicing medicine in Prescott for 15 years, long enough to understand that medical emergencies didn't respect social boundaries or racial prejudices. When Jack burst through his door carrying a desperately sick Apache infant, the doctor's only concern was saving a child's life. Pneumonia, Dr. Henderson confirmed after a quick examination. Severe case, but not hopeless if we act quickly. What followed were the longest hours of Jack's life as Dr. Henderson used every tool of modern medicine to fight for Little Star's survival. Steam treatments to help her breathe, carefully measured doses of medicines that were still experimental, and constant monitoring to detect any change in her condition. Is she going to live? Jack asked after 18 hours of vigilant nursing. Too early to tell, Dr. Henderson replied honestly, but her fever's starting to break and her breathing is improving. Apache children are often stronger than they appear. By the third day, Little Star was clearly improving, taking water and milk with increasing appetite, and looking around Dr. Henderson's clinic with the bright curiosity that marked healthy babies. She's going to be fine, Dr. Henderson announced with the satisfaction of a doctor who had won a difficult battle. Another week of rest and proper feeding, and she'll be strong enough for the journey back to her mother. But during that week of recovery, word of Jack's presence in Prescott with an Apache baby had spread throughout the territorial community, creating complications that threatened everything he'd worked to protect. Mr. Sullivan, Mayor Charles Blackwood said as he entered Dr. Henderson's clinic with 2 territorial marshals, "We need to discuss your situation." Jack had been expecting this confrontation since arriving in town. "What situation is that, Mayor?" "The situation of a white man traveling with an Indian child, claiming to be her guardian, while military authorities are actively searching for Apache bands in the region. This child was sick and needed medical attention," Jack replied calmly. "I brought her to the doctor. That's all." "Where did you find this child, Mr. Sullivan?" The question was loaded with legal implications that Jack understood perfectly. If he admitted to living with Apache people, he could be charged with providing aid to hostile Indians. If he lied about Little Star's parentage, he could be arrested for kidnapping. "Mayor Blackwood," Dr. Henderson interrupted. "This man rode through a blizzard to save a child's life. Whatever his relationship to the baby, his actions were heroic and should be commended, not questioned. Dr. Henderson, we appreciate your medical expertise, but this is a matter of territorial security. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to ask you again, where did this child come from?" Jack looked down at Little Star, who was reaching up toward him with tiny hands, completely trusting and unaware of the adult complications surrounding her care. In that moment, Jack made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "Mayor Blackwood," Jack said quietly, "this is my daughter. Her mother is my wife. We've been living quietly in the mountains, bothering nobody, just trying to raise our family in peace." The statement created exactly the reaction Jack had expected: shock, disbelief, and barely concealed outrage from the territorial officials. "Your wife?" Marshal Davies asked skeptically. "And where exactly is this wife? Safe at home, waiting for us to return?" "Mr. Sullivan," Mayor Blackwood said slowly, "are you claiming to be married to an Apache woman?" "I'm claiming to be married to the woman I love, who happens to be the mother of this child who nearly died because I couldn't get her to medical help fast enough." The boldness of Jack's public declaration sent ripples through the small crowd that had gathered outside Dr. Henderson's clinic. Intermarriage between white men and Apache women was not illegal in Arizona territory, but it was so rare and controversial that Jack's admission made him a figure of intense curiosity and heated debate. "This is highly irregular," Marshal Davies said uncomfortably. "Marshal, what's irregular is a man having to explain why he saved his own daughter's life," Dr. Henderson said firmly. "Now, unless you're planning to arrest Mr. Sullivan for being a devoted father, I suggest you let him finish caring for this child in peace." 2 days later, Jack and Little Star began the journey back to the Apache village, but they weren't traveling alone. Word of Jack's story had reached the Apache community through the mysterious communication networks that connected all native peoples in the territory, and Chief Running Wolf had sent an escort to ensure their safe return. "Father worried about you," Gray Eagle explained as he rode beside Jack through the mountain passes, also worried about what white authorities might do if they learned location of Winter Village. "They won't learn it from me," Jack assured him. "We know this. But trust must be proven through actions, not just words." When they finally reached the hidden valley, the reunion between Ayanna and her daughter was so joyful that it brought tears to the eyes of hardened Apache warriors who had seen too much sorrow in their lives. "She's well?" Ayanna asked, examining Little Star with the careful attention of a mother who had nearly lost her child. "She's perfect," Jack replied. "Dr. Henderson says she's stronger now than she was before she got sick. And you?" Chief Running Wolf asked meaningfully. "Are you stronger than you were before this journey?" Jack understood the deeper question his Apache father was asking. The journey to Prescott had forced him to declare his loyalties publicly, to choose between the safety of anonymity and the risks of standing up for his family. "Yes, sir," Jack said firmly. "I know exactly who I am now, and exactly where I belong." As spring returned to the Arizona mountains and the Apache band prepared to leave their winter village for the seasonal rounds that would take them through their traditional territory, Jack Sullivan prepared for a future that would be unlike anything he had ever imagined. His days as a solitary cowboy were over forever. He was now a husband, father, and member of an Apache family whose survival and prosperity had become more important to him than his own comfort or safety. The Bar T Ranch would have to find a new line rider. Jack Sullivan had found a new life, built on the foundation of one November night when he chose to save a mother and child from wolves, not knowing that in saving them, he would discover his own true family and his own true home. Years later, when territorial historians wrote about the successful integration of Apache and white communities in central Arizona, they would trace the beginning of that cooperation to the winter when a cowboy named Jack Sullivan proved that love and loyalty could transcend all barriers of race and culture. But for Jack, the history that mattered was much simpler. The sound of Little Star's laughter echoing through the mountain valleys, the warmth of Ayanna's hand in his as they watched their daughter grow into a strong, proud young woman who belonged to both worlds and was diminished by neither. The wolves that had once threatened his family were gone. In their place was something infinitely more powerful, a love that had chosen to grow rather than hide, to stand publicly rather than exist in secret, and to prove that some bonds are stronger than any force that tries to break them. In the end, that was the only legacy that mattered to the cowboy who had saved a trembling Apache mother from wolves, and in doing so, had saved himself from a life of loneliness he had never realized he was living until he found the family he never knew he needed.